morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Gina Duvernay, and I am the Adult Services Manager for Gwinnett County Public Library. So we'll get started. Today, we're honored to be joined by Dr. Hannah Rose Murray. She is a historian based in Queen Mary, University of London. Her research focuses on Black activism in the transatlantic. Her first book, Advocates of Freedom, African American Transatlantic Abolitionism in the British Isles, was published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. And her accompanying website is www.frederickdouglassinbritain.com, which attempts to map as many Black activists' speaking locations as possible across Britain and Ireland. She has organized numerous community events, including talks, school workshops, heritage plaques, performances, podcasts, plays, exhibitions, and physical, actual, real walking tours on both sides of the Atlantic. So we're so happy to have you here, Dr. Murray. I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Gina. Thank you so much to everyone at the library and to you all for listening and tuning in. I'm so happy and honored to be here. As Gina was saying, my name is Hannah Rose, and one of the things I love to do is lead in-person but also virtual tours around particularly London, but other parts of Britain as well, really championing and trying to tell the story of African American freedom fighters who travelled to Britain and Ireland in the 19th century to give lectures against racism, against US enslavement, and against white supremacy. Essentially, these are some of the figures who I talk about on a sort of a regular basis, inspiring activists that who travelled to Britain and Ireland, and we'll talk about some of them today. On the top left is Moses Roper, and we'll be talking about him a little bit. I'm sure you'll recognise Frederick Douglass in the top there as well, and Ellen Craft as well. I'll be talking a little bit about her. And there are so many freedom fighters that I discuss in my research and that I could talk to you about today. But in our limited time, I'm just going to focus on one of the tours that I run in London, which is a tour specifically focusing on literary work. So Black American literary work, whether that's autobiography, poetry, handbills to advertise lectures, anything that's related to writing or print culture, essentially. And the really exciting thing about this history is that there are so many sites in London and around Britain that still exist that hosted an African American giving a talk. And today, there aren't, in the tour I'm going to take you on today, there aren't too many sites that still exist, because the area of London that I'm going to be sort of virtually showing you, if you know London at all or know London's history, and I talked a little bit about this actually in the previous talk that I did for the library, is that a lot of areas of London received bombing damage during World War II. So a lot of these venues were unfortunately destroyed. But just wanted to illustrate this slide as it's a really beautiful example of lots of sites around the country that still exist, that hosted a Black freedom fighter that came over across the sea to discuss their and relate their experiences of enslavement and racism. And you can see here there's a range: churches, top left used to be a church, and is now a club on a Friday night in Birmingham. But there's lots of different examples of these places that still exist, and they're really, really important places in British cultural history and memory, and also transatlantic memory and American memory as well. So I want to start, first of all, before we get into the main tour properly, to talk about and to really illustrate how Black activists were central to the fight for freedom. We know that, but they were also central, of course, to the anti-slavery movement. So we have Black activists like Olaudah Equiano, who is pictured here, Ignatius Sancho, Mary Prince, Black British activists who were really central in campaigning for the abolition of enslavement and slavery in the slave trade in the British Empire. 1807 was the year that Britain abolished the slave trade, and they abolished slavery across the British Empire in the 1830s. But of course, in Britain in particular, there is a focus on Britain abolishing the slave trade without actually acknowledging the history of Britain was one of the main the main nations involved in perpetuating the slave trade, and obviously became incredibly wealthy because of the slave trade, something that Olade Equiano talks about in his book. And I wanted to start here for several reasons, because this book, written by Equiano, published in London in 1789, is recognized by historians and educators as the first major work of Black autobiography, or what's known as the slave narrative. And Equiano's book, published here in London, is really, really important for us to understand this history of Black autobiography. And this is why this date is incredibly important. And what's really interesting and fascinating about this history is that slave narratives, Black autobiography throughout the 19th century came in lots of different shapes and sizes when we think about Black Americans publishing, writing, all different types of material on British soil. And in their books and in their narratives, they were talking about their own histories. They were relating their own experiences of enslavement and racism, their liberation, self-liberation to the northern states or to Canada, and then eventually to Britain, where a lot of these books were published. And they really championed that liberation, the liberation of others, Black heroism. And they really targeted pillars of racism and white supremacy in the US and also in Britain. And in these books as well, they talked about the Civil War, sometimes their active service as well in the Civil War. And today, obviously, I'm specifically focusing on literary works and slave narratives. And it's really important to say that these slave narratives written by formerly enslaved people, survivors of US enslavement, were and can be regarded still very much as protest documents. They were writing about their experiences of enslavement. They were radical, they were politicized, they were incredibly important for the anti-slavery movement and the social justice movement. So there are hundreds of narratives that have managed to still exist. There are some on the Documenting the US South website that you can read for free. There are several around Britain and Ireland that have been published that lie in archives here. And they cover a whole range of different subjects, from different types of enslavement, from different states, from Louisiana to Maryland, different experiences of racism and torture, self-liberation, whether that was on the Underground Railroad or other forms as well. And another key thing to note here too about slave narratives before we get into the sort of main tour is that for certain autobiographies, particularly those published in the UK, although this applies to the US as well, certain narratives had to look a certain way, because when they were published, sometimes they were published with the support of a white abolitionist. And this really gets into the heart of complicated politics where white abolitionists was often had to write an introduction or a testimonial in the front of that autobiography to essentially say that this particular freedom fighter or survivor of enslavement was authentic, in inverted commas, and was a true survivor of enslavement, and essentially they were who they said they were. So that implies a lot of patronization and racial politics there. And it often meant that if a freedom fighter couldn't get that testimonial, then their autobiography couldn't be published, or it wouldn't have the widespread circulation and distribution that others would have. So this is a really, really important point that we have to kind of state up front, and I'm happy to go into a little bit more detail later about that. And there were some narratives too, actually, which I will say is that some narratives were written by white abolitionists. So a Black freedom fighter would essentially tell their story to a white abolitionist, and that abolitionist would write the story down. And there are issues when we sometimes come to read that story, what is being left out, what is being edited, because that white abolitionist often curtailed and edited the language and the structure and the format, sometimes would take out certain words or phrases or stories that that person had related because it was deemed too violent, too graphic for the sensibilities of a white British audience, for example. So there are lots and lots of problems with it. But I've got this slide up because I wanted to illustrate the various types of narrative as well that were published not only in centres like London and Birmingham and Manchester, but really around the UK, whether we're talking about rural locations or urban centres as well. So on the left-hand side, there is a broadside essentially. And the eagle-eyed among you might be able to see in the bottom right of that broadside on the left, the price was 1 penny. So a broadside was very much designed to be a cheap circulation, particularly for folks from a lower socioeconomic background. And it was designed to essentially, it was quite an ephemeral document, essentially, because it was so cheap. But on the right-hand side, we have more of a sort of straightforward narrative and autobiography in the structure that most slave narratives published in the US or in Britain were designed. And you can just see at the bottom of the screen there how small this particular narrative is. It's just a phone, an old phone now, but essentially the size of a kind of general iPhone. That's the kind of size that we're looking at. And I do want to state as well that there were a number of African Americans who chose to write their story down for lots of different reasons, but it's also really important to highlight that there were many survivors of enslavement who deliberately chose not to write down their stories. They really spurned white Western educational practices or white supremacist educational practices in universities and writing down material, and instead focused on visual ways of telling their story, paintings, drawings, panoramas, plays. All of these things were not necessarily a kind of literary form, but still just as important, which is a really important point. So I'm just going to get a map up. So hopefully now you should be able to see a little part of London. You can see the Thames right at the bottom of the screen there. So if we were walking this, it would probably take about an hour or so. And you can see it's a little bit of a straight line with a peak all the way through central London. We're starting here on the left-hand side at the Strand, which is really close to Covent Garden, so a central point of London, if you know London at all or if you have been there. And then we end up on the right-hand side past St. Paul's Cathedral and into a place called Barbican. So the first stop is the Strand. So the Strand is a really key street in London. It always has been throughout its history, still is very much now, very close to, as I say, Covent Garden and sort of the heart of London. A lot of the buildings I'm going to show you today, unfortunately, don't necessarily exist, but the streets still do. Hence why we're virtually standing here today. And literally right opposite us and to the left used to stand a publishing house at 337 The Strand. And that was the location of William Tweedy, who was a publisher, worked out here in the Strand. He was an abolitionist. He was a reformer, believed in temperance. So essentially the abolition, or at least the reduction of the sale of alcohol. And he was a key publisher who ended up publishing a few books written by African Americans, most notably William and Ellen Crafts. And obviously, I can't give a talk in Georgia without talking about the Crafts, but I won't talk about them for too much today, as I talked about their story in a previous talk to you. But we do know, of course, that the Crafts' death-defying liberation from enslavement is now widely celebrated on both sides of the Atlantic. Obviously should be widely celebrated, and even more widely celebrated than it is. But this particular story focuses on the self-liberation of Ellen and William Craft, the courage and the heroism of Ellen Craft for crossing the boundaries of race and gender and class and physical ability to perform as a white Southern enslaver. And William and Ellen Craft traveled 1,000 miles from Georgia all the way to Philadelphia, and eventually they settled in Boston and also settled in England for nearly 20 years, and they raised a family here to essentially escape white racist practices and their enslavers, who essentially were sent white men up to kidnap them once they had liberated themselves to Boston. So interestingly, the Crafts book, which I'm sure you will heard of and many of you may have read, the Crafts book, Running 1,000 Miles to Freedom, was published in 1860 in London out of this publishing house by William Tweedy. And it didn't receive a US publication. It was only published in London, and it was obviously circulated to the US, but it only had a London publication. So that makes it a really interesting part of British and transatlantic history. The other thing that, or the other book that I want to chat to you about today is John Anderson, who some of you may not have heard of. And again, on the bottom right of this picture, you'll see the publishing house, William Tweedy, 337 The Strand, where we're virtually standing. And this book was published in 1863. And John Anderson was born into enslavement in Missouri. He liberated himself in 1854. And during that flight, an altercation ensued between Anderson and a white farmer named Seneca Diggs, who essentially cornered Anderson and threatened him with re-enslavement if Anderson didn't willingly go back to his former enslaver with Diggs. And Anderson refuses, and he says very carefully and meticulously and clearly, if you attempt to kidnap me, I will fight back. And that's exactly what Anderson does. He manages to fend off Diggs' attacks, but Diggs gets wounded in the process. And he actually dies 2 weeks later as a result of the injuries that Anderson attacks him with, obviously through his self-liberation. Anderson settles in Canada, and he's there for several years until around 1860, when the American authorities realize that he is in Canada and they essentially want to extradite him for the murder of an American citizen. Now, at this point in American history, as you all know, African Americans are not regarded as citizens of the US. But this basically leads to a really complicated international legal problem, because Anderson is currently living in Britain, and essentially there were many in Canada that did want to extradite Anderson to the United States, but essentially that legal court in London provided a writ of habeas corpus, and a Canadian court then granted a new writ of habeas corpus on the basis that Anderson's potential arrest was essentially insufficient. So the court in Canada eventually argued that Anderson hadn't actually committed a crime. He was fleeing for his life. He was liberating himself. He obviously gave Diggs warning that he was not going to be retaken. He was not going to be kidnapped. So after this particular verdict, Anderson actually travels from Canada for his own safety to Britain, where he stays here for about 3 years. And Britain and British abolitionists really celebrate the notion of what they deem as British justice, that essentially British justice had saved Anderson's life and that he was now safe on British soil. And there's lots of things that we can do to unpack that, in terms of that was very much patriotic language. British justice in sort of the British system obviously did not account for Britain's continued wealth and growth as a nation as a direct result of enslavement in the US. How Britain had obviously maintained and supported the slave trade, that there were numerous people of colour in Britain who were suffering under sheer poverty, because many of them were excluded from employment and housing and work, simply because they were Black. So all of those realities of being Black in Britain were incredibly difficult. And every single person of colour experienced racism on British soil. So there's this real disconnect here between obviously what's going on in the newspapers and these very patriotic anti-slavery meetings. And to really illustrate this patriotism, Anderson gives a speech not far from actually where this publishing house is. It's literally on the same street down the road, or the site of where he gave the speech, at this huge, or what was a huge venue called Exeter Hall. It could hold between 4,000 and 5,000 people. It was well known as being an anti-slavery venue. Anderson is giving a speech there about his liberation and his travels to Britain, and he's presented by white abolitionists with a vial of English soil as a testament to his freedom. So again, that's a sort of illustration of this patriotism around this language of Anderson's journey, essentially. So Anderson is here for 3 years. He stays in London for a little bit, and essentially this particular narrative is published by a white abolitionist called Harper Twelvetrees. Brilliant name, you won't necessarily forget it. So this is an example of one of the narratives I was talking to you about, where Anderson has essentially related his story to a white abolitionist called Harper 12 Trees. And 12 Trees has essentially edited it and written it up in his own words. So there are a few problems with this narrative because of that. But it tells us some idea about Anderson and his character, who he was, and essentially how he got to in England and some of the meetings that he had. So that marks the end of the first stop, and just about 10 minutes walk away. And again, it doesn't look a particularly exciting street. This is Farringdon Street. And I've talked a little bit about the African American whose work was published here before, and his name was Josiah Henson. So he is the freedom fighter sitting down in this photograph next to a standing journalist and British social reformer called John Lobb. And essentially, just the street where I've just showed you was the home of the publishing house of the Christian Age, which there's an image there on the left-hand side. And the Christian Age was a journal published by John Lobb in the 1870s and the 1880s. And Josiah Henson travels to Britain in the 1870s, in 1876. And he was a survivor of enslavement in Maryland. He had liberated himself and his family and had settled for decades in Canada. And he had raised a lot of money and supported a lot of self-liberated African Americans in Canada. And he travels over here in 1876 to essentially help raise funds to pay off his mortgage. A lot of the money that he had raised and that he had attempted to accumulate were essentially the benefit for his community. So paying off his mortgage, obviously, and at this particular age, he's 88 at this point, would have obviously helped him and his family. And Josiah Henson had a claim to fame that John Lobb in particular really adapted and exploited, because John Lobb was fascinated to discover that Josiah Henson was very much seen as the inspiration for one of the characters called Uncle Tom in Harriet Beecher Stowe's infamous novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe reportedly read Henson's narrative, which was published a couple of years before Stowe's book went public and essentially went viral in its day. And Henson was rumored to be based on this character of Uncle Tom. So Henson comes over in 1876, and his tour is incredibly popular. And Henson had actually visited Britain before, nearly 20 years before. But in this tour, he works with John Lobb to essentially create a very extensive lecturing tour. He speaks around the country, here in London and in other cities as well. And again, I mentioned his age, he's 88 by this point, so it's an impressive feat, but he's talking sometimes for up to 2 or 3 hours in certain performances. He sings as well. And through John Lobb's religious connections, because this was a religious magazine, Henson speaks in a variety of different churches and chapels, particularly around London. And within 6 months, Henson speaks to 500,000 people. So this is a really extensive lecturing tour. And in the Christian Age, there are numerous adverts and sort of attesting to Henson's success. And his literary work as well, called Uncle Tom's Cabin. There's a revised edition. So you can really see how Lobb, who is the editor here, is capitalizing on that success of that novel and Henson's relationship to this novel. And this revised edition of Henson's autobiography is a bestseller. 65,000 copies were sold in 6 months, which is an incredible figure for the late 19th century. And the narrative, this book was translated into Welsh, Danish, Swedish, Dutch, French, German, Norwegian, and together with another book, essentially called the Young People's Illustrated Edition of Henson's life. So it was essentially a book for children about Henson's life story. That book and this one that you're looking at sold about 250,000 copies. So a really extensive sale. And as I mentioned in the previous talk, and I'm happy to go into this in a bit more detail, but Henson had a really complicated relationship with this character of Uncle Tom, because we know And we use this phrase, or this phrase is used, sorry, now, Uncle Tom, as very much a sort of racist and racial epithet. And Henson knows that even in the late 19th century. And there were many times where he actually rejected that association. And he gets up on stage in one meeting where he's actually introduced as the Uncle Tom. And the first thing he says in this speech is, "My name is not Tom. I do not want any other name inserted in the newspapers other than my own." So he's really rejecting that and pushing back against that sort of racist name. Okay, we're going to move on to the third stop. And this is one of the few places, although the image, I have to apologize here, the image for Google Maps is not great because this is Stationers Hall and it's a very, very small, hidden away building in a courtyard, essentially. So this is pretty much as good as I can get with Google Maps. But this is a very, very old building and a London institution, really. And you can see here, this is an artist's impression on the right-hand side of what the Stationers Hall would have looked like in the 19th century. And originally, the Stationers Company has existed since 1403. So obviously centuries old. And in 1606, that company essentially published this house that we're looking at, but it was severely damaged in the Great Fire of London in 1666. So essentially, this building that we're looking at was built in 1673. So it still has this amazing history. Obviously, that is still centuries old. But obviously, additions like the one that we're looking at on the right-hand side, extensions were of course added. And I can't not talk about Stationers Hall because in relation to Black literary work, because it's really important to point out that there were narratives and autobiographies written by Black women who were, as we know, really central to the social justice and anti-slavery cause in the 19th century and, of course, today. And Mary Prince's autobiography is really key because it was the first, or is known as the sort of the first slave narrative published in 1831 that was published by a Black woman. So this is a really important work in Britain and also in transatlantic history for Prince's story, her testimony, her essentially autobiography of what she experienced as a woman of color. And Mary Prince came to Britain. She initially she was enslaved by that point, but she liberated herself and worked with the Anti-Slavery Society in Britain, and hence why we have this publication of her book. But Mary Prince was not the only Black woman to write herself into history, as we know, particularly on this side of the Atlantic. But I want to use her story as a bit of a springboard to talk about some of the other literary work published specifically by African American women here in London. And Sarah Parker Remond was a key figure here. She was a freedom fighter, a social justice advocate. She was born in Massachusetts. So she was not born into enslavement, but she experienced horrific racism and segregation. Her whole family did, obviously, since the day she was born. And she travels over to England in the late 1850s and she conducts a really successful lecturing tour around Britain and parts of Ireland as well. And you can see here from the marker on the right-hand side, she actually dies in Rome. She trains to be a physician in England and she travels to Italy and she lives in Florence and Rome and dies in Italy. She refused to live in a segregationist United States. And she is a really key figure in Italian history, British history, American history, transatlantic history. But while she was in London, she writes numerous letters. She writes part of an autobiography. She writes an appeal for African Americans to enlist as soldiers in the Union Army during the Civil War. So she is a prolific speaker and she is a prolific writer. And one of the examples I just want to share with you today is that in 1859, Remond applied to the American embassy for a passport to essentially travel over to France. And she was actually denied this because by 1859, as I mentioned with John Anderson, African Americans are legally and formally not recognized in a sort of white supremacist narrative. They were not recognized as citizens. So Remond can't go to France because of this. So she chooses to publicly humiliate the embassy in a series of letters that she writes to the British press. And she claims that she is a citizen of the US. She was born free in Massachusetts. And again, she receives another letter from the embassy denying that she was a citizen. And essentially, Remon argues back that your letter, she says, the embassy is extraordinary. You now lay down the rule that persons freeborn in the United States and who have been subjected all their lives to the taxation and other burdens imposed upon American citizens are to be deprived of their rights as such, merely because their complexions happen to be dark, and that they are to be refused the aid of the ministers of their country, whose salaries they contribute to pay. So Frederick Douglass, actually, when he is traveling around for the second time in Britain, he's also refused a passport to visit France. So this was not a rare occurrence. There are other African Americans too who traveled over to England to try and publish their autobiography. Harriet Jacobs, obviously a very well-known African American and activist and freedom fighter. She travels over to London and initially cannot get her narrative published in London because few publishers were prepared to actually print it. But she manages to do so after the first American edition. And this is the Boston edition here that was published in 1861. And there are other African Americans as well. Dinah Brown publishes a narrative in 1863 with the assistance of a white editor, an abolitionist. And we also have a lot later in the century, Ida B. Wells Barnett, because as I mentioned with Josiah Henson, for different reasons, African Americans were still traveling to Britain and Ireland after 1865, after that legal abolition of enslavement in the US, because those legacies of enslavement and racism, of course, were very much active in and through white domestic terrorism, segregation, Jim Crow laws, and lynching. And Ida B. Wells Barnett publishes a lot of material against the lynching of Black Americans. Ida B. Wells Barnett, of course, as many of you will know, an inspiring freedom fighter, an abolitionist, and social justice activist. And her writings and speeches here in Britain, as well as in the US, were powerful condemnations of torture and rape and the lynching of Black Americans that was taking place not only across the southern states, but across the entire United States. And Wells Barnett actually visits Britain twice, in 1893 and 1894, to raise support for the anti-lynching movement. She works in particular in 1894, her visit is really successful. She works with MPs and religious ministers and merchants and all classes of society, really, to condemn lynching. And some of her work is published here in Britain. So she is obviously a really important figure, again, in British and transatlantic and American history. So the next place I want to talk to you about, this street still exists. So this is Paternoster Row, and it's very, very close, pretty much opposite St. Paul's Cathedral. So this street very much exists, although now it's obviously full of apartments and shops and various eateries and things. But in the 19th century, this street, Paternoster Row, was very well known for essentially being a literary hub and a publishing hub in particular. And there were several narratives and autobiographies that were published here. You can see here, hopefully on the slide now, these sort of beautiful illustrations of what Paternoster Row used to look like. But there were several narratives, like I mentioned. So Ignatius Sancho, in 1782, his autobiography was published. Solomon Bailey, here on the left-hand side, 1825. There was a magazine called The Leisure Hour that was published in Paternoster Row that included in 1861 an autobiography by John Jacobs. And we also have Samuel Ringgold Ward's autobiography that was published here in 1855 by various publishers. But the main activist that I want to sort of introduce you to who published a work on this street was Moses Roper. And Roper was born into enslavement in North Carolina in 1815. And he experienced enslavement through numerous white enslavers. He experienced horrific torture at the hands of all of his enslavers. And he managed to liberate himself and find temporary freedom in the United States, in terms of the northern states in Boston and New York, until he has rumors that his previous white enslavers had essentially sent white men up to New York and Boston to where he was settling to drag him back down into enslavement. So American soil is not safe for him whatsoever. He is incredibly terrified that of that kidnap and also potential assassination if he refused to go with those men. So Roper travels over to England and he stays here for several years. He publishes a narrative, an autobiography, first in 1837, which was one of the first narratives published by an African American on London soil. So again, this is a really, really important work. This book that you're looking at right now, this is actually an 1848 edition, so a little bit later. And so far as we know, this is the only known image that we have of Moses Roper from this particular book. And there are thousands of this work that was sold, 38,000 copies by 1848 by this edition, including 5,000 copies of this book were translated into Welsh. So when Roper was traveling around Wales and speaking to Welsh audiences, several of these audiences would not have had English as their first language. Many of them didn't understand English. So having this book translated in Welsh was obviously really important for the local population. And in fact, there were several African Americans who did travel to Wales, and on occasion there was a Welsh translator next to the speaker. Excuse me. The really amazing thing about Moses Roper is that he was a bold activist. He always attacked white enslavers, white supremacy, not only in the US, but also particularly in Britain. And there are numerous times that he uses his books and other essentially literary or printed forms to do that. So just to give you an example, when he publishes his book, he relates later how he sent numerous copies to his former enslavers, which is an amazing and bold tactic. And every single enslaver that he could remember, he sent a copy to, essentially to illustrate that their crimes were being talked and discussed about abroad, here in Britain and also in Ireland as well. So that's a very revolutionary and political act. And he also, another example of this is in Birmingham, in the Midlands here, in 1838, he is walking down the street in Birmingham and he walks past a shop with whips and chains and manacles in the window, because a lot of these weapons of torture are actually made in the UK and they were transported and sold to enslavers in the US. And Roper knows firsthand the absolute pain and torture of how those instruments were used. His back was hideously scarred and his body was hideously scarred with those weapons of torture. So he goes into the shop to confront the clerk. Moses Roper could pass for white, and essentially in his final liberation attempt, that is really, really key. So essentially when Roper walks into this shop, the clerk thinks that he is a white man and starts to try and interest him in buying some of these instruments of torture. And what Roper does is that he essentially, in this really amazing and powerful performative technique, he goes along with this ruse for a certain amount of time and then produces a copy of his book as this reclamation of his identity, and says obviously who he actually is, in terms of he is a survivor of enslavement. He has written this book, and this book included illustrations of him being tortured with those same instruments of torture that were being used in that shop. So that is a really powerful and revolutionary form of activism there. Now, Roper speaks hundreds of times. I've recorded at least 2,000 times, but there would have been far more lectures than that in the years that Roper was here. And this is another form of printed material or literary material that Roper interacts with. And these are examples of surviving examples of handbills that Roper organized and had printed. And these ones are very unique because, as you can see from some of the details here, they would have been specific to just one lecture. So for both, they give the particular date, the venue, obviously who's speaking, Moses Roper. And these were essentially designed to be given out on street corners, to be put up on windows, to advertise people to essentially come and listen to him give a talk. So Roper had to work with sort of local newspaper editors and also printers to essentially maximize his chances of getting people to some of his lectures, because he was a lecturer traveling around to so many places. He needed that support financially to keep that tour going, but also this was his main source of income. So this kind of connection to publicity and trying to get people into those venues was really important, not only to hear him speak and to hear his testimony, but to provide donations and also to publish his book, that copies of his book were distributed at the end of his anti-slavery meetings. And here's a couple of other examples of handbills. The one on the left is from 1844, and then one on the right is actually from the 1880s in the US. So there's a huge gap there. And he was still continuing to lecture in the 1880s, although albeit with certain gaps. But these two here that we're looking at are really specific handbills, because they saved money on printing costs. Because unlike the first two I've just showed you that had the specific date and they could only be used for one performance, the handbill on the left, obviously you can see the gaps there. On would have been blank evening, blank 1844. So it would have been easier to print numerous copies of this handbook and then quite literally handwrite the details in between. So, and as you can see actually through definitely on this handbill on the left and also in the first two, Roper almost always exhibited weapons of torture in his lectures to really hammer home this concept of this notion that enslaved people were being brutally tortured every hour of every day in the South. And that meant with quite a lot of pushback in some of his meetings from white British audiences who sometimes within their very racist understanding of enslavement and African Americans, they believed that he was lying and not telling the truth. His graphic accounts of enslavement were exaggerated. So as if it wasn't traumatic enough to relate his own experiences of torture and enslavement, he was also having to deal with people calling him a liar in his meetings, standing up and physically shouting at him. So these are all the different things that Roper had to contend with. And I have an image here of Phyllis Wheatley, who I'm sure you would have heard of as well. Her book of poems, Revolutionary Book of Poems, was published here in London in the late 18th century. And poetry was another sort of literary medium and form that African Americans experimented with. Many of them created and composed their own poetry here on British soil, whereas others like Roper actually interacted with white British poets and white British poems. They recounted verses from famous anti-slavery poetry, like that of James Montgomery's poems published in the 1820s against enslavement and the slave trade, because these poems really resonated with several of these African Americans who had experienced that level of unfreedom that white abolitionists and these white poets could never understand. And interestingly, there were many people who listened to Roper give a speech and composed their own poetry. So there were ordinary members of the audience who were so inspired to not only join the anti-slavery cause in some cases, but who were actually inspired to write poetry based on Roper's life and based on what he was saying in a particular lecture. And there are numerous poems written to Moses Roper, Frederick Douglass, and numerous other African Americans who were traveling around Britain and Ireland. And these poems were sometimes published in the local press. The local and provincial newspapers would always have a poetry section, and there are numerous examples of poems that were they usually had the title of lines dedicated to Moses Roper or Frederick Douglass, and they were always inspired by someone listening to him speak, which is a really interesting example of an impact of these tours, but also just a really interesting example of literary and cultural history. The last thing that I want to say about Moses Roper, before I very, very quickly finish on the last stop, is Roper was forced to use the medium of letters to defend his reputation, because I mentioned earlier that there were several people in the audience who rejected Roper's history and stories. And this happened pretty much from one of his first lectures that he gave in England in 1836. And he had to write to a local London newspaper to essentially counteract the fact that someone had said he was lying. And he basically had recounted a really graphic form of murder. And someone had called him out as a liar. So he writes a letter to essentially graphically write and meticulously write the details of that murder. And he writes, I trust my evidence will be received on matters of fact which have come within the range of my own observation. And once again, he's forced to use this medium of letters when a former supporter and abolitionist called Thomas Price, who had initially supported Moses Roper, actually wrote a letter to a London newspaper in the early 1840s to discredit Roper's reputation. And Roper is forced to use several letters writing back to that London newspaper to defend his reputation. And this has a real impact on Roper's lecturing tour. The letters that Thomas Price had written have a really damaging impact on Roper's tour. Doors are quite literally shut in his face, and he can't necessarily have and organize certain meetings in certain areas in London and just outside London. And as I mentioned before, his tour is based on financial survival, publishing those books. So if he's having doors shoved in his face, shut in his face, sorry, that has a huge impact on his financial survival and the survival of his family. By this point, he had married a white English woman, and he had two daughters. So this has huge implications. Very quickly, I will just end the tour on the last stop, which was a short one anyway. So if you'll bear with me. On the right-hand side, this sort of beautiful modern building, this particular area of London was sort of bombed during World War II, so it no longer exists. But this was the house of Charles Gilpin, 5 Bishopsgate Street. And Charles Gilpin was a reformer, he was an abolitionist, and he worked very closely alongside one African American in particular, William Wells Brown. And Gilpin actually published several editions of Brown's books, including a narrative, which you see here on the left-hand side, and also a travel narrative on the right-hand side. And you can read these books online through that Documenting the US South website. And the travel narrative in particular is so fascinating because it gives us an indication of what it was like for Brown, for an African-American man, to travel around England and Ireland and Scotland in the 1850s, how he was getting from one place to another, carriage, train, etc., and his experiences of traveling around. And Brown was a brilliant writer, speaker, performer. He'd been born into enslavement in Kentucky before he liberates himself and travels over to England. And in one speech, I just want to read you this beautiful quote that he has, because he struggles to find the language, as all African Americans did, to describe the true horrors of enslavement. It was something that could not be put into language. But he says in one speech that if I were to tell the true character of slavery, I would pluck a feather from the wing of some fallen angel, dip it into the wailings of despair, and write upon the blackened walls of perdition in characters which would frighten the hyena out of his ferocity. So I will leave it there. Hopefully you would have had some idea about some of these really great and powerful historical documents and forms of literary work that African Americans have interacted with and used and published here in the UK. And essentially how this really celebrates how people of colour have put pen to paper or to print to essentially write themselves into history, champion Black heroism, and really raise support for the anti-slavery cause. So thank you so much for listening. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer.
Dr. Murray, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, and apparently our attendees did as well. We have some hand claps in the chat. Okay, there is a question. Thank you. Would you speak to the importance of periodicals to Black publishing in the UK?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it was really important because it was sometimes easier to publish literary work in a periodical rather than essentially publishing an autobiography as separate, because you had to think and put a lot of extra work into circulation, distribution, advertising. Whereas if it was already within a periodical or published within a periodical, you already had a steady distribution network anyway. The key or the unique example of this really is the case with Josiah Henson, because John Lobb has the Christian Age, this magazine, and when he took it on, he really he's a very savvy advertiser. He literally extended the circulation of the Christian Age by thousands within a very short space of time. So he uses that periodical to actually advertise a separate book, and he's packing in adverts and interviews with Josiah Henson notices of where they're traveling and stuff like that. And that obviously fuels the fire for the publication of that book. And in the Christian age, something I didn't have too much time to get into, not only were they including adverts to that book and sort of asking and encouraging people to buy that book, but they were also Lob was advertising the young people's edition as well. So it was just this sort of constant work, being written about in these periodicals. I mentioned one other as well. So John Jacobs published his autobiography within a periodical as well. So I think definitely they are very, very important. I think in terms of slave narratives, there were and autobiographies. There were several that were obviously published by themselves. But a lot of and just to say very quickly, a lot of this history very much depends on connections and who knew whom and networks, because some African Americans, like I mentioned with Moses Roper, he had a standalone autobiography and required a lot of communication with his printers as he was traveling around, and required more editions, paying off printing debts, things like that. But in other places, obviously these periodicals, again, like I mentioned earlier, did that work for him or for others. And then you had other African Americans like John Seller Martin, who worked really closely with a lot of key and influential religious ministers, who then had links to certain periodicals like the Baptist magazine and the Harbinger. William Craft, he doesn't publish or have his narrative published in there, but he has other letters published in there. So it's just all about those connections, which can be seen in lecturing tours too. Because when someone was conducting a lecturing tour, if you knew someone in this city, then an African American would go here and they'd say, oh, I know someone in this city, and go there. So it was those sorts of networks and communications and correspondence were super important.
Well, perfect.
Thank
All
you.
right. Well, thank you, Dr. Murray.
Thank you. Take
All
care.
right.
Thank you so much.
Okay.